With thank you for lots of folks. First, I'm going to thank you for your patience in that last hour. I feel like I should give that priorities and purpose lesson again, at least the first half hour of it. But I appreciate you for your patience as I battled through that little catch that I had that just simply would not go away. And I'm going to follow that up with, listen, a lot of you have made it ready for me up here. I appreciate. Listen, I've got a full cup of water right here. If that doesn't do the trick, I've got another whole water bottle over here I can work off of. I've got people that have put little lozenges up here. I'm in good shape. I should be able to make it through. I certainly appreciate that, and I appreciate you being here. The choice you've made to worship God today. The Lord's Day is a beautiful time that I relish each and every opportunity that I can be with God's people, whether it's at Traders Point with our congregation at home or whether it is here worshiping with you, people who love God. It is a special, special time. And again, as Phil made mention, an opportunity to worship with dear friends. We don't get to see as often as we once did, but certainly what a great week that we have in store to be able to spend some time with each other. So we're going to get into it a little bit this morning, and we're going to talk about, we're going to begin by kind of painting a picture. Maybe you have a very similar thing that I have. I look at it as an incredible blessing, that in every way I have been blessed by God. And what I have been blessed by God with, among so many things, but one thing I have most certainly been blessed with is what I like to just refer to as an active mind. I don't know about you, but for me, my mind is always moving. Now, that benefits me in a lot of ways. I'm able to think very quickly for the most part. I'm able to handle things that come along very quickly because my mind is very active, it is very busy. But yet, on the other hand, there comes some challenges with that as well. And one of those challenges for me is focus. Because my mind is always so busy, because my mind is always so active, I often find myself struggling with the idea of focus, controlling that busy mind. So this morning for a few minutes, I want us to talk a little bit about that biblically. Maybe you too have a very active mind. Maybe you have a very busy mind like mine. Maybe your mind isn't as busy, but whether your mind is very, very active, whether your mind isn't as active, the same applies for all of us. We have to still control that mind. We've got to control it. And when we talk about controlling our mind, it's going to come down to the idea of focus. Just a dictionary definition of what focus really is all about. A central point of attraction, attention, activity. It is that centralized point. It is that focus as maybe I would focus on this lit up exit sign. And although there are things going on around, I am centrally focused on that exit sign. It is that idea that I want us to talk about this morning. Because for us as Christians, in the culture that we live in, it is a challenge. But most certainly, as we'll see this morning, a challenge that we can overcome. So I want to direct your attention back to last summer. Last summer was the Olympics. And I'm a huge sports fan, and so I'm a fan of the Olympics. I enjoy watching the Olympics, and maybe you enjoy watching the Olympics as well. And the last summer, as we were watching the Olympics, my middle son, Malachi, and I were flipping through, and it came on the mixed doubles table tennis gold match. And it really became a very entertaining and fascinating match for a couple of different reasons. It was the Chinese pair up against the Japanese pair. But what made it really interesting was number one in the world versus number two in the world. But that number one in the world, the Chinese pair, had never lost. Ever. They had never lost. They were undefeated. They had never, ever lost in any competition, ever. And in this competition specifically, it was so fascinating to watch that this ended up being their first loss. The Japanese pair beat the Chinese pair. But as we were watching, one thing stuck out, and Malachi and I could not stop talking about it. We were amused by it at first, but then that quickly turned into something that we're going to talk about. The female of the Japanese mixed pair, Ito is her name, every time she served, I could not stop watching. She was focused. I'll give you a closer picture to that. Every single time she had the ball, and as you see in the picture, I mean, it was intense focus. Now, again, as I made mention, we were amused by this at first, right? It was so striking to see every time that she served her do this. But Malachi made mention that he was right. He's like, man, Dad, that right there, that'd make a good sermon, right? That'd make a good sermon. I was like, yes, son, that would make a good sermon. And so I made a mental note of that. These images are very easy to get a hold of. But you look at a picture like this, in a moment like this, I mean, the gold medal match, the Olympics, in their home country, with people yelling and screaming all around. And every time she went to serve, she was able to focus. One thing. And so for us, we've got to recognize the need for that. We've got to recognize the need for this kind of focus. Now, most of us desire that, right? I mean, if we were to go around the room and went one by one, and we were to ask, listen, do you desire spiritual focus? Every single one of us, right? Every one of us would say, absolutely, I do. I desire it. I want that. I want this kind of focus spiritually, right? I want this kind of focus on God. I want to have this level of focus. If we were to go around the room, we could take the time, all of us say, yes, yes, I want that. I desire that. But then how can I achieve it? So this morning, I want us to look at a few practical things that can help us to achieve spiritual focus. And what's really interesting is that when we work through some of these kinds of things, I want you to understand this morning, we're going to be talking about some things that you can implement to help your spiritual focus. You can implement immediately. Now, not something that you can work on down the line or something that you could put, years and years away. Hopefully, I'll be able to, get to that one day. We will talk about things this morning that you can implement immediately, today even, to help you in your spiritual focus. And so I've got a few things that I think could be helpful, and we'll work through these things as quickly as we can. And the first is this: begin every day with God. We read from John chapter 15. Maybe you're still opened up there. We're going to spend some time in John chapter 15 really throughout this week. It's a big part of what your Vacation Bible School is, about the idea of Jesus and us and the vine and the branches and all of those things. But I want you to understand from John chapter 15, certainly the perspective of John 15, is it is about abiding. Abiding as a word, specifically that relationship with Christ, that's repeated in John 15 over and over and over and over and over again. It's the idea, attached to Him, we are something special. Detached from Him, we are trash. We are thrown away. And that idea is pretty easy to understand, right? We don't like to say it like that because it sounds crass to kind of say it that way. But attached to Christ, we are something special. Detached from Him, we are thrown in the garbage. That is the striking difference between those two things. And John 15 really paints that picture. There's a great promise given to us here and an incredible warning. The great promise is that if you stay attached to Christ, you will bear much fruit. That's what we're going to spend a lot of time this week talking about. And here, as adults, the children as well, you stay attached to Christ, the promise is you will bear much fruit. But there is also a warning that if you detach yourself, you'll be thrown away. So when we think about this idea about beginning every day with God, it's not about beginning some days or beginning most days. It is about beginning every day with God. And I know sometimes you hear, and rightly so, and maybe your preacher is this way, I'm the same way, that we'll get up here, and we're going to talk about prayer here in just a moment as well, but we'll get up here and we'll talk about prayer, we'll talk about Bible study, and we'll say, you know, the preacher will say, listen, you got to pray every day. It's something, I don't know how many times I've said it as a preacher from the pulpit, that you got to pray every day. I don't know how many times, lots of times. But every time I say that, I always make a promise. I promise, I'm going to say, hey, you got to pray every day. I'm going to promise you, I'm going to say that again, right? Or you got to study every day. You got to study every day, and I promise you, I'm going to say that again, because it is so vitally important. But oftentimes we'll make the point, and rightly so, that when we're building habits, say such as prayer habits or study habits, we've got to find parts of the day that work for us. Maybe the beginning of the day for your study that works for you, but maybe the end of the day works for you, or the middle part of the day during a break that you have that works for you. You've got to find that part of the day that works for you. I believe that. But I also want you to understand the importance of beginning every day with God. This should be something that makes sense to us. If I'm going to stay focused on God, I have to include Him in my daily life. Well, if you're anything like me, a lot of times our mornings are very rushed and our mornings are very busy. We've got to discipline ourselves to make time for God, to talk to Him about the day ahead. How much easier it is for us to focus on God if that is the thought I begin the day with. Not the thought that I get to later, or the thought that'll come up down the road, but it is the thought that I begin with. That here is the day. Here is the day that God has given. Here is the day that God has laid out. Here is the day that God has put in front of me. And I will begin every day with God. Now I want to build on that. I've already made mention of it. But we've got to be prayerful for sure. If we're going to be focused on God, we've got to be prayerful. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 17, pray without ceasing. It's a passage that we have. And certainly this is a habit worth developing. Sometimes we think, well, man, developing habits, that's hard. That's hard to do, right? We talk about developing habits. We do that all the time with, hey, developing good eating habits. It's hard to do. Developing good exercise habits, that's hard to do, right? At least it's hard for some of us. I think about developing good eating habits, and I know I need to develop good eating habits. And mentally, I know I need to develop good eating habits, and my doctor tells me I need to develop good eating habits, and everyone around me tells me I need to develop good eating habits. I believe that. But I don't, because it's hard to do that. Because I like cheeseburgers, and I like French fries, and I like Twinkies and cookies, right? And donuts. I like those things. So it makes it very difficult. We know we need to have good exercise habits, but that's hard to do because exercising is hard. I admire the person that gets up in the morning and they go on a run the first thing in the morning. I admire that. I think it's ridiculous, but I admire it. I mean, just to run for no reason, just to run, I don't understand that, but I admire it. I do. But it's hard. And sometimes when we talk about prayer, or we talk about Bible study, we talk about those things, and about building those habits, we convince ourselves that that's hard. It isn't. It really isn't. It isn't as difficult as you think. You see, prayer in every way is powerful. It is life-changing. And when you see a passage like 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verse 17, pray without ceasing, it is that idea that when I'm seeing opportunities throughout my day, I'm going to pray. I'm looking for opportunities. I'm taking advantage of those opportunities. Sometimes when it comes to prayer, we convince ourselves that God is looking for our long or our drawn-out, pious-sounding discourses. That's what God wants. Well, think about what God wants. What does he want? What he wants is our heart. That's what God wants. That's what he desires. He wants our heart. And sometimes that can be as simple as, Lord, please help. 3 words. Lord, please help. Let's talk about another one. Turn to Joshua chapter 3. Joshua chapter 3. Hopefully this coughing doesn't start again. Joshua chapter 3. To me, there's a really interesting thing that takes place in the book of Joshua. And sometimes, it really becomes, one of those passages you think a lot about and you ask yourself, why? What was the purpose? What was the purpose of this? When it comes to focus on God, again, something that makes sense, even physically, we see it all the time. If we're going to focus on God, we have to limit distractions. What that means is there's got to be nothing between you and him. We understand that concept. You really understand that concept if you've ever gone to a movie or you've gone to a show or a sporting event where someone sits right in front of you with a giant hat on or giant hair made up, right? You understand that immediately. Here someone has sat in front of me and I'm ready to focus on what the show is or what's going on, and now someone is sitting directly in front of me. I can no longer focus on what I wanted to focus on. I've got to lean around, or I've got to stand up, or I've got to lean over. I've got to do something else, right? Something is in between what we want to focus on. So we need to limit that. Look at Joshua chapter 3. Joshua chapter 3, listen beginning in verse 1. Joshua chapter 3, verse 1. When Joshua rose early in the morning, they set out from the acacia grove and came to the Jordan, he and all the children of Israel, and lodged there before they crossed over. And so it was after 3 days that the officers went through the camp, and they commanded the people, saying, when we see the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and the priests and Levites bearing it, you shall set it out from your place and go after it. Yet there shall be a space between you and it, about 2,000 cubits by measure. Do not come near it, that you may know the way by which you must go, for you have not passed this way before. There's an interesting phrase here. I've read this passage before, and it is the space between the people and the ark. There's a couple reasons for it. One of the reasons we talk about a lot, and I think certainly is there, 2,000 cubits, about a half a mile, in between. He says, don't go near it, be back from it. So ask yourself, what was the purpose of that? What was the reason for that? Well, he gives the purpose for that. Number one, you're not going to come near it. It's special, it's holy. It's got to have its place. That's the thing we talk about a lot, right? And there's lessons about the ark and the movement of it and who can touch it and who can be around it. And there are certainly lessons and commands given specifically about that. But he goes on. Don't come near it, verse 4, but he adds, that you may know the way by which you must go, for you have not passed this way before. There seems to be some indication that this distance is put there so that everyone will be able to see it. Everyone will be able to follow it. Everyone will be able to follow where it's going. And I thought about that. What an interesting thing. Maybe it's because the terrain would be of such, and they're putting themselves in a position so that there's nothing in between them and the ark. They'll always be able to see it. And for us, it's much the same way. There are all kinds of distractions that we fill our lives up with, right? We're trying hard to focus on God, but that becomes difficult because of something standing in the way. Maybe it's our work. We want to focus on God. We want to be able to worship Him, but often work gets in the way. Gets in the way of that. We allow work to get in the way of that. Maybe it's a hobby that we like or some piece of recreation that we enjoy. We want to focus on God, but we find often that piece of recreation gets in the way. Maybe it's our family in some way. Gets in the way of that. Now, all of us understand that. Let's not make getting over that any more difficult than it is. We all know what it takes. We all understand it. We all have to deal with distractions for sure. Something that's in the way of God. He's there. Something is in the way that's causing me to have a problem to see Him. Well, if I want to see Him more clearly, let's not make this any harder than it is. We've got to clear that distraction. We've got to get it out of the way. Now, maybe that equals a difficult decision for sure. Maybe that makes for a very complicated conversation with someone. Absolutely. But let's understand it is much more simple than sometimes we make it. That something is distracting us from God. Something is standing in the way. Well, get it out of the way. Clear the way so that you'll be able to see more clearly. I want to build on that with this next one. I want to build on that same idea. Now, in a lot of ways, this could have been the very first thing we talked about. Look at the book of Hebrews in chapter 12. Hebrews chapter 12. This could have, in a lot of ways, been the very first thing that we talked about. I thought it goes real well with limiting our life's distractions. But I want us to think about just the importance of when we're trying to focus on God, we're looking to focus on Him. We're looking to maintain that level of focus. Well, we've got to limit our distractions, but we've got to remove sin. Sin is something that gets in the way of that because it is a problem with my relationship with God. It turns that relationship off in a lot of ways. And so if there's sin, I've got to remove that. Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 1, listen to what the writer says. Therefore, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Now, the picture that's painted there for us by the writer is one of a race. And you're going to run a race. And he says, listen, if you are burdened down with something, a weight of some sort, don't run with that. Take that off. I mean, he almost seems to put it in kind of that makes perfect sense world, right? If that is weighting you down from the race that you're running, get rid of that weight. No one likes working with weight anyway. No one likes it. No one likes it. We'll see, there's one of the other evangelists that I work with, John Morgan at Traders Point. Him and I, just this week, went and visited one of our elderly ladies. She had fallen and broken her hip, and she's in a rehab place, and she's doing some rehab. I think she's 89, 90 maybe. And we went to visit her, and her husband was up there, and they were actually in physical therapy. They were heading that way, and so they asked if we'd like to join. I said, sure, so we head that way, and so she gets herself, a 90-year-old lady, she's in a wheelchair, and she's getting ready to do some exercises with the physical therapist there. Just some leg raises in the wheelchair, left and right and everything, and so he's getting everything ready, and he walks over to a wall, and the wall is filled with, like, ankle weights, different weights, where he was going to take them off and put them around her ankle, to make a difference. So he walks over to where the weights are. Before he's even grabbing any of them, she's sitting in the wheelchair, and I hear this. Let's not do the weights today. And he's like, no, 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 we've got to do the weights. And she's like, no, let's just not do them. Let's just not do them. She didn't want to. She's like, it's harder with that. I don't want to do it. It's harder with that. And so he came over and he put the weights on. And I'm telling you, no exaggeration. She did, I don't know, a half hour of exercises with those weights. There may have been 20 different, things that they were doing. After every single exercise, without fail, they'd finish, he'd count to 20, he'd be like 18, 19, 20. Good job. Can we take these off now? Every single time. Because in her mind, it's like, it's a lot easier without these things on. Listen, that's what the writer is saying right here. If you're going to run a race, don't burden yourself down. Don't burden yourself down with sin. Don't burden yourself down. Get rid of that. Now, for us, when we're talking about focus, it is the exact same thing. Sometimes I think we make things so much harder and so much more difficult than they really are. It's in a simple way. If there is something or someone or some place in your life right now that is leading you away from God, or that keeps you from your prayers or from your fellowship with other Christians, or someone or something or some place that distracts you from God's word, there is only one option. Remove that thing from your life. It is the old adage, you kill the sin or it will kill you. And that is a reality. And so if there is something, some sin in your life, and that involves a person or a place or a thing, and that is distracting you or leading you away from God, get rid of that thing. Let's not overcomplicate it. Let's not make it harder than what it needs to be. Get rid of that thing, because ultimately it comes down to the idea of making a choice. Jesus will talk about it in Matthew chapter 6. In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 24, as he's talking about the idea of making a choice, he says it, no one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon. He says, listen, when it comes down to focus on God, and it comes down to limiting your distractions, when it comes down to centralizing your thought process on God, sometimes we're like, I don't know, that seems so hard or that seems so difficult. Just make a choice. That's what it comes down to. You see, Jesus laid it out in a very simple kind of way right here, didn't he? Why do I say it's simple? Well, I'll tell you, it's simple because Jesus says there are two choices. That's it. Now, we convince ourselves there's lots of different choices. Jesus says there's one choice here, you follow God, or there's another choice over here, you follow the world. That's it. Those are the only two choices. And I'll tell you, it is a choice that I have to make. And it is a choice that you will make. We can do our best to abstain from that choice. We can try to plead the fifth, or we can try to play Switzerland, and we can try to stay out of it and say, no, I'm not going to make that choice. All of us make that choice. All of us do. You remember where we started this lesson? If we went around person by person by person, is your desire to be focused on God? I think everybody in here would say yes. But is everyone here focused on God? I hope that's the case. Statistically, though, it isn't. Statistically, there are folks here this morning that aren't focused on God at all. I think they want to be. But they're not. And so it comes down to making a choice. And what I like about the things that we have on the screen here behind me, whether it's beginning every day with God or staying prayerful or limiting our distractions or removing sin, making that choice, these are all things that can happen immediately. Let's close with this thought. Back to Romans chapter 12, or excuse me, Hebrews chapter 12. Back in Hebrews chapter 12, you have this idea of verse 1, but also think about verse 2. Verse 1 again, we also, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which so easily ensnares us, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us. Well, what does that enable us to do? We've been burdened down with all of this sin, with all of this weight, and the Hebrew writer says, get rid of all of that. Get rid of all of that weight. Get rid of that sin. Prepare yourself so that you can run the race. Get rid of all of that. And so verse 1, get rid of all of the sin. Get rid of all of the distractions. So what does that enable you to do? Well, the sentence even continues. Verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. You know, it's interesting when you put that whole verse together, it really begins to make sense. Weighted down with all of the sin and distractions makes it impossible to look unto Jesus. But you remove all of those things, and you are ready to focus. Focus on what? You focus on Jesus. It's a race, right? An endurance race. A race that can only be run and finished if our focus is where it needs to be. So as we close, real quick about all three words together. We talked this morning about priorities. We talked this morning about purpose. We talked this morning about focus. Right? Well, now we start to place all of those things together. Making sure that God is the only thing in our life. Not one of the things, or one of the top things, or one of the best things. He is the only thing. He dictates everything in my life. And I am focused fully upon him. Are there distractions? Sure. But do I have to be distracted? Nope. And that's the lesson I want you to understand this morning. We often talk about, boy, we live in a culture, it's full of distractions. There's so many distractions. There's lots of shiny things. There's lots of temptations. And there are. But I don't have to fall for any of those things. Well, how is it that I can make sure I don't? Focus. If I am focused, all of those distractions won't make a difference. And that's the lesson we've got to take this morning. And as we push through this week, talk about all of the good things, all of the blessings that come from having a relationship with Jesus, all of that stems out of focus and understanding our purpose in this life. I appreciate you listening so well. Phil's going to lead us a song of invitation. An opportunity to think about our relationship with God. We've talked a lot about it already, right? Our relationship with God. It is the only relationship that matters. We've got lots of relationships for sure, but there is one relationship that makes a difference. Eternally makes a difference, and that's God. We've got to make sure our relationship with him is right. And what a great opportunity we have this morning for us to think about it, for us to meditate upon it. And it is a great opportunity for everybody, all of us here this morning to do. All of us to be thinking about it. All of us to be meditating upon it. All of us. And maybe there is something this morning that can be done to help you. Some of this group here can help you with. If that's the case, you let that be known as we stand and sing.